Hello and welcome to another Stellarian Games video. In this episode, we're going to be looking at how to make this canyon city, which is quite a project. Took quite a lot of effort to make all of the stacks and tiers and all the little buildings painted, decorated, put in vegetation, all of that. But it was worth the effort. This was a project that I wanted to do, more of a personal project because I love making really tiny miniature things. But it was also the inspiration for a good chunk of our last campaign. We spent many sessions in this town, and using this map was a great way for the players to interact with it, see where things were, and plan out different events as they were looking at the city. Because it's so vertical in nature, they were able to plan, different kinds of approaches to buildings, whether it was up or down, in or out. It was a great way of interacting with this map. So let's go to the table and see how this is done.
All right, to begin with, we're going to start by cutting out some foam squares or rectangles in the size of 11 by 17. I chose this size so that I could eventually store this in a paper box where you get reams of paper. I actually decided to design the whole thing with kind of a topographic map to begin with. So I printed that off with all of the various lines, and I cut out the first layer of that topographic map, tracing it out on the styrofoam so that I end up with a cutout of that first layer that will end up getting stacked in. Cutting that out on the hot wire cutter, and then going back and for this first layer, trimming down and creating that riverbed that will be kind of that first ground level of this topographic map. Just using some sculpting tools to create kind of a rocky texture in that ground layer. Then I'm going to cut out the next layer on the topographic map on the paper, trace that out back onto the styrofoam, and again back to the hot wire cutter, cutting out that next layer, having it pre-printed and then cutting out each layer by layer gives me a good starting point of how far I should layer in the next layer and kind of work my way up the stack of various pieces. Just kind of dry fitting just to make sure everything is working okay and coming out the way that I expected to in the end. Next, I'm going to texture the edges of all of those pieces by just kind of scraping into them and giving them a nice rock texture. I'm doing that for all of them, and then also adding in some various step gardens and things like that into those various different layers. I'm hot gluing each of those layers together, and this will start forming kind of a firm structure to start creating the rest of the elements. Then I'm going to go to the hot wire cutter and start cutting out a whole bunch of the different building options. I had to come up with some creative ways of creating temples and amphitheaters and things like that. And so creating just large circle structures with the hot wire cutter was one of them, but also kind of cutting in and then adding just another cut on the inside of that to create that outer layer. That outer layer I can use to cut and trim with an X-Acto knife and end up with a much different looking amphitheater. Then I was cutting out the actual edge of that styrofoam to let that amphitheater sit neatly into the edge of the hillside. I wanted to kind of build into the hillside. Then I'm cutting off some thinner layers for that amphitheater. And then I created another jig to cut at an angle so that I could have an angle for all of the seats in the amphitheater. With that, then I used a very sharp X-Acto knife, cut out kind of the front edge of the amphitheater, and then seat by seat just trimmed little steps into the amphitheater. Then the thin piece that surrounds it will end up with arches, and cutting each of those little arches out by hand, first kind of sketching them in with a pencil, and then using that sharp X-Acto to cut out the top arches of that amphitheater. Gluing that outer edge in place, and then putting in some towers to edge kind of that open space. It's creating some interesting architectural features for this amphitheater. Once all that's in place, then we can start gluing the rest of it in and get that amphitheater glued into place and start working on some of the other details. Layer by layer, I also cut in some tunnels into the hillside, so they actually are tunnels all the way through the hillside and into another spot. Once I have all those buildings done, I also remove them and put them back onto one of the topographical maps, so I knew where they would go when I was done painting it all. Giving all of the layers a texture with a tinfoil ball just to give it a nice rocky texture. And again, hot gluing those various layers into place. The tunnels I'm pre-painting black, the ones that I had cut through the hillside. That way I knew I wouldn't have to worry about trying to get black paint into those tunnels at some point. Then I'm using some coarse, say, putty that's used for art projects. So it's a coarse grain molding paste, and using that to kind of fill in some of the edges so that it didn't have quite such a right angle when the cliff hit the ground. So just kind of using that to fill in some of the ground space. Adding some sand with white glue. Just add, again, some more texture to the ground and give it some more interest. Then I use some large corks with pins in them to poke into each of the buildings so that I could have something to hold on to them with, and painted them all with a black base coat. And then added various shades of tan and other colors to paint all the buildings, kind of that desert tan look to them. So they're mostly tans, maybe some reds, some greens for roofs and things like that, because they probably have tile roofs. But just giving all of the buildings a nice base coat, and then adding some details with various other colors. This one you can see it's going to have a nice stucco color. Again, trying to keep with that desert theme. All of the buildings are just hand-carved little styrofoam blocks, just cut out in random blocks and textured with an X-Acto knife or some small sculpting tools, just kind of poking in windows, cutting in some doors and arches and things like that, just to give it some interest as you look at the piece in more detail. Roofs got a different color than the rest of the buildings, just to have, when you're looking in from the top, there's something more interesting to look at. But I'm not going to give these any, washes or any overcoats or anything like that. This is really small buildings. They just need a very basic paint scheme. Now for the overall painting, I'm basing it with just some black house paint. This will be that undercoat for the whole piece. And then starting with a dark brown and working my way up to lighter and lighter dry brushes of that tan to give it that desert rock feel. So the undercoat is pretty thick brown, and then we'll start dry brushing that tan up and over the top. This really gives it the nice kind of sandstone feel that a canyon like this might have. And then lastly, much lighter dusty colors, so that'll be kind of the edges and highlights, which will really make the kind of the terraces really pop. Then I attempted to create kind of some water effects by using some clear caulk, adding some ink to it to create kind of a muddy watercolor. That was my hope with this. This is one of those times where I'm trying something that I haven't really tried before with this caulk, and added it in for all of these rivers. And you'll see later on that I really didn't like the results. Some of it I left in place because it was thin enough and it was able to dry, but it ended up not curing fully clear. So that ended up being kind of a bad choice for the project, but it was a good learning process. So I started trying to put in some black here to give it the feeling of depth, because it wasn't really curing clear. Just seeing what I could do to get that to look a little bit different, and then came in with some white to add some ripples in water where there might be rapids or waterfalls, and then added in a clear gloss coat to try to have that water effect. Again, for the thinner rivers, it worked okay. I was halfway satisfied with the thin rivers, but the big water section really didn't end up the way that it needed to. As you can see, it ended up being very white, and I wasn't happy it wasn't curing the way that it needed to, so I just came in with a blade and started cutting out the edges, and a screwdriver and some sculpting tools just try to pry it away from the edge of that canyon, and ended up coming in with a pliers and just ripping it out to kind of do something different. I had to come up with a different solution for what I could fill in that water effect with something that would be decent. So what I tried next is mixing up some rock hard wood putty. I have worked with this in the past where I knew it would dry very smooth and not do a lot of shrinking on me. So I knew it would be opaque, but that was okay. I'll paint it and make it work for this scenario. So I put that in, got it so that it was nice and flush where I needed it, let that harden up, and then I could come in and paint it with that black undercoat. That'll be the concept of depth in this. Letting that dry and then coming in with some of the browns and tans to simulate that there's depth in that water as best I could. And it works. It works fine with that approach. Then adding that clear gloss over the top again, that'll add the sheen for the water effect. Then I started gluing in the buildings. The first was the water wheel for the mill, and then the building over the top of the mill. And then a small filament of basically fishing line or fiber optic fiber to create a clear drop point from the mill's water spout out to the lake. So those clear filaments are just going to be the guide for adding in some more gloss on top of them to give it kind of a cascading water effect down those points. And then on the step terrace, I decided to put in a lot of the vegetation before the buildings got in. So I put in a variety of different colors of vegetation and sizes of vegetation to simulate there would be different crops growing in this kind of arid space. There's an aqueduct that leads to that water mill, and then all of that green, the excess just gets vacuumed out. Putting in some mini pins, painting them up with a dark brown to be the trunks of trees. Going to poke those into place on this backside. This is going to be the orchard that kind of helps feed the valley, and then gluing on a small chunk of turf on the tops of them to simulate small trees. And then starting in the process of gluing in all the various buildings. On the right, there is a vineyard and the gardens, and then all of the various different temples and buildings and houses that go into this town. This is a really satisfying step in the process where you get to this point and you're just assembling the town and seeing it kind of come to life for the first time as it's really getting put together. All the various buildings in their spots with the different looks. You can see I cut in some of the building recesses that I designed buildings to fit into, and that gives kind of a sunken and built-in feeling into the side of this cliff. All of the bridges over the valley also got cut in, so you end up with some nice floating bridges over the water to connect all of the town. And then adding in a little bit more green down by the water side, just because there would be more greenery down where the water is, where the rest of this is largely desert. All right, that is the end of the construction phase, and here are a bunch of pictures of this canyon city. Again, this was a super fun project for me. It was kind of a personal project, but it was also a lot of fun to play on, having all of these small buildings and details that people could kind of explore, not just in their imagination, but also be able to see it and explore with their characters. So I hope you liked this video. If you do, please hit the like button and subscribe, and we'll see you again next time. Thank you.